We've just got some breaking news in from Buckingham Palace, folks. So this statement has just come in from Buckingham Palace, and I'll read it for you. It goes on to say, His Majesty has today initiated a formal process to remove the style, titles, and...
The words were brief, but their meaning landed like a thunderclap inside the royal family. Diana's most private archive, letters, personal recordings, handwritten reflections, photographs, and carefully preserved memories, would pass to one person alone, Prince George. For Meghan, the announcement carried an unmistakable finality. What had once seemed like a family legacy open to interpretation had suddenly been placed beyond her reach, protected for the boy destined to inherit William's future crown. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Meghan read the confirmation twice, and the second reading hurt more than the first. The formal family arrangement named George as sole future heir and custodian of Diana's private archive, giving him responsibility for a collection other branches could neither divide nor control. It held letters, photographs, reflections, recordings, keepsakes, and private material never meant to become ordinary palace property. She reached the final page, saw his name again, and slowly lowered it onto the table. Harry watched from across the room, understanding what her silence meant. His mother's memory lived deep within him, yet the decision forced him to confront the difference between emotional connection and control. He understood why Diana's eldest grandson mattered to William's family, but Meghan's reaction sharpened the truth. Loving his mother did not automatically give the Sussex household authority over what she left behind. When she asked whether he knew George would receive everything, his hesitation wounded her. The decision carried another layer. George was not simply receiving the collection as ordinary property. A custodial structure, an arrangement designed to preserve sensitive material until the named heir is old enough to take responsibility, would restrict copying, publication, transfer, and exhibition. The archive could not be broken apart because different relatives wanted different pieces. William's influence sat quietly behind every line. For months, the future king had pushed to keep Diana's private material intact, rather than let family interests pull it apart. He believed fragmentation could turn memory into conflict, and conflict into rival versions of the same woman. George, in that reasoning, represented continuity rather than another side in an old struggle. Meghan remained still. Shock was becoming something harder. If George had been chosen alone, then someone had decided that Diana's legacy needed one protected path forward. Harry wanted the same answer she did. Who had shaped that decision? And what happened behind closed doors to make it inevitable? But George's name on the final page was only the conclusion. To understand why it appeared there alone, Meghan would have to confront the deeply personal roles William, Harry, and Diana's grandson had come to occupy. Diana's legacy was never simply a collection of possessions. For William and Harry, it remained tied to childhood, grief, memory, and everything they had lost before either man was old enough to understand its consequences. Yet George represented something different. He was not another participant in the brothers' old wounds. He was Diana's grandson, William's eldest child, and the future king, a living bridge between the woman the monarchy lost and the institution she once challenged. William had spent years trying to separate the mother he remembered from the public figure the world continued to debate. The archive mattered because it held the private Diana, handwritten thoughts, personal photographs, family exchanges, and pieces of a life that existed before every memory became part of royal history. George's place in the direct line of succession, the family line through which the crown is expected to pass, gave the future king a unique symbolic position. To his father, placing the collection eventually in those hands meant keeping it together, rather than allowing it to become another source of division. Harry understood that argument, but understanding did not remove the sting. His concern was never simply ownership. He feared something more personal, that over time, Diana's story might become permanently rooted within William's branch, while his own children stood outside the circle, protecting her most intimate memories. Meghan recognized that fear immediately. She told him that Archie and Lilibet could grow up knowing their grandmother, yet still remain observers of a history controlled somewhere else. William had anticipated that criticism long before the confirmation arrived. Years earlier, he had quietly raised the possibility of naming a single future custodian, convinced that divided control could produce competing interpretations of Diana's life. During one private conversation, Harry had pushed back, asking why one descendant should ever hold greater responsibility for their mother's private legacy than another. The disagreement had never truly disappeared. It had simply been buried beneath more immediate family tensions. George knew almost none of that conflict. In one quiet moment, William sat beside his son and placed a carefully preserved family photograph before him. He did not speak about legal control, inheritance, or rival claims. Instead, he explained that some family possessions carried a duty greater than ownership. Some things, he told the boy, were passed down because they needed protection, not attention. Harry would have understood the sentiment. Meghan might even have understood it too. But neither yet knew why William's original preference for one custodian had eventually become a firm boundary that no one could cross. That lesson had been shaped by a moment almost nobody outside the family knew about. And once it happened, William's position hardened beyond negotiation. The decision did not begin with a lawyer, a palace announcement, or Prince George's name appearing on a final page. It began with one private request. During a tense family exchange months earlier, the future of several pieces from Diana's personal collection was raised unexpectedly. What sounded at first like a simple question about access quickly became something far more consequential, and William left that conversation convinced that his mother's archive needed permanent protection before family disagreements could fracture it forever. Meghan had entered that Windsor meeting focused on something deeply personal. She wanted to know whether selected letters and pieces of Diana's correspondence could someday be copied for Archie and Lilibet, giving them something tangible from the grandmother they would never meet. The archive, meaning the protected collection of private letters, recordings, photographs, and personal material kept together for preservation, had already become a sensitive subject. Some believed parts should remain sealed. Others saw value in future exhibitions, charitable projects, family access, or carefully controlled research. William heard the request differently. He did not object to Diana's grandchildren knowing her story, and he made that clear. What disturbed him was the idea of duplication. One copied letter could become two. One private recording could leave its original setting. Pieces removed from the whole could later be published, interpreted, or used without the surrounding context that explained what his mother actually meant. To him, that was how memory became fragments, and fragments became competing versions of the same person. Meghan leaned toward the folder, as she explained that her children deserved more than second-hand stories. William pulled it slightly closer and closed it. His response was controlled, but the firmness surprised her. Once the collection started being separated, he said, nobody would ever be able to put Diana's story back together again. Meghan went quiet, yet the silence did not signal agreement. It marked the beginning of resentment. William moved quickly after that meeting. In private discussions with advisors, he asked for a protective structure, preventing any one relative from separating, copying, selling, publishing, or independently transferring sensitive material. George emerged as the solution because one future custodian could keep the collection intact while also preserving its connection to Diana's family and the crown. Meghan remembered Windsor differently. To her, she had asked for memories for her children and watched a door close instead. When she later understood that this very exchange had helped harden the final arrangement, sadness turned into anger. Months later, with George now officially named, that closed folder returned to haunt the family, because Meghan was no longer willing to let William's reasoning go unanswered. The confrontation was not loud at first. That made it worse. Meghan entered knowing exactly what she wanted to ask, while William already understood why she was there. There were no cameras, no ceremonial smiles, and no carefully prepared public phrases to hide behind. Two people now stood on opposite sides of Diana's legacy, one demanding to know why an entire branch of the family had been shut out, the other convinced that protecting the archive required precisely that sacrifice. Meghan had refused to let the matter pass through lawyers, secretaries, or Harry. She wanted the answer directly from William, and he agreed to give it. But the prince made one thing clear almost immediately. George's designation would not be reopened. The inheritance structure, the formal arrangement deciding who would eventually control and protect the collection, had already been settled. This meeting was an explanation, not another negotiation. Meghan did not accept that distinction easily. She told him he had effectively decided which grandchildren would become guardians of Diana's memory, and which would remain outside that responsibility. Archie and Lilibet, she insisted, were no less connected to their grandmother because they lived away from Britain. William listened without interrupting, but his answer stayed firm. The children were not being denied Diana. What was being denied was divided control. Emotional connection, he argued, was not the same as ownership of an archive. Meghan pushed harder. She asked the question that had been sitting beneath every other argument. Was George chosen because he was Diana's grandson, or because he was the future king? William paused. That silence carried more weight than a quick denial would have. Then he admitted that both realities mattered. George stood inside the direct line of succession, but he was also young enough to inherit the responsibility without being part of the old conflict between Diana's sons. Harry's absence suddenly felt deliberate. Meghan understood that William had kept his brother out of the room, because he did not want the conversation to become another battle over childhood grief, old wounds, and everything that had divided them since. She pushed her chair back and told him, with controlled anger, that history should belong to a family, not a succession line. William remained seated. He looked directly at her and answered that history survives only when somebody accepts responsibility for protecting it. Meghan left with something worse than frustration. She now understood William had shaped the decision, but he had not possessed the power to make it permanent alone. William had supplied the determination, but one signature transformed that determination into something Meghan could no longer challenge, and the person behind it had remained almost completely silent. For all the emotions surrounding William, Harry, Meghan, and George, the decisive power rested somewhere else. Charles understood better than most that Diana's memory existed simultaneously as family history and national history. He also understood the danger of allowing unresolved family divisions to determine the fate of intensely personal material. When the final papers reached him, the king faced a choice that was both institutional and painfully intimate: intervene, or allow Diana's archive to become another battlefield between his sons. Charles studied the file longer than anyone expected. Diana's name on the cover carried a history he could not separate from his own life, and every page reminded him that the conflict was no longer only about the past. The proposed custodial framework, a legal structure designed to keep sensitive material together under controlled responsibility, would separate Diana's private archive from ordinary crown property. That distinction mattered, because family letters, personal recordings, and intimate memories could not simply be treated like official royal assets. The king also understood why George had become central to the solution. The boy represented continuity without carrying the scars of William and Harry's disputes. By allowing the archive to pass forward one generation, Charles could keep Diana's legacy from remaining permanently trapped between her two sons. Yet that logic did not remove his concern for Harry. The monarch knew the younger prince might see the arrangement as another door closing, and he did not want custodianship to become emotional erasure. Charles removed his glasses and set them beside the papers. He asked one final question. Would both of Diana's sons still be able to see appropriate family material? The advisors confirmed that controlled access could remain possible, even though ownership and final responsibility would eventually rest with George. Only then did his expression settle. The protection itself was deliberately strong. Future disputes, marriages, commercial projects, changes in residence, or pressure to publish could not easily pull the archive apart. George would inherit responsibility before freedom. Even when the collection fully passed into his custody, he would be expected to protect living relatives, preserve private context, and resist treating Diana's most sensitive material as something to use casually. Charles picked up the pen. He signed. When Meghan learned that the king had approved the arrangement, the last possibility of changing William's mind suddenly looked meaningless. The prince had shaped the plan, but Charles had given it final force. Persuading one man would never have undone what the monarch had now made permanent. The signature ended the argument on paper, but inside the family, it was the moment the emotional consequences truly began. Meghan had reacted with disbelief. William had defended the decision with certainty. Charles had given it permanence. But Harry faced something more complicated than any of them. The archive belonged to his memories too. Diana's handwriting, her private photographs, the fragments of a childhood cut short. None of these were abstract pieces of royal history to him. Yet the new reality placed their future protection in the hands of his nephew, forcing Harry to separate love from possession. Harry received the terms quietly. George's future custodianship, the responsibility to control and protect the archive when he became old enough, did not erase his uncle's access to appropriate family material. But it did mean Harry could not remove pieces, transfer them elsewhere, or treat part of the collection as independently his. Archie and Lilibet would still know Diana through stories, photographs, and approved family memories. Yet they would not stand beside George as co-heirs to the private archive. Harry carried that distinction back to Meghan, and the weight followed him into the room. He admitted that seeing George's name had hurt more than he expected. There was no resentment toward his nephew. The pain came from somewhere older. One branch of Diana's family would physically protect the collection, while his own children would grow up separated from that responsibility. For him, the arrangement made years of family distance feel suddenly permanent. Meghan challenged his restraint. She asked whether accepting the decision meant accepting that it was fair. Harry did not answer quickly. He understood her anger, but he also saw another danger. Contesting George's inheritance could turn Diana's memory into a battle between grandchildren who had played no part in the wounds separating their fathers. That was a line he was no longer sure he wanted to cross. Then one detail changed the temperature. Harry learned through a documented private briefing that William had specifically insisted appropriate personal material remain available to Diana's younger son. The prince had not asked for his brother to be erased. He had asked that control stay unified, while personal connection remained possible. Harry looked again at the old photograph resting near him. He ran his thumb along its edge, while Meghan asked whether he intended to challenge the arrangement. His answer came quietly. Before he fought anything, he needed to know what William had truly been protecting. Was it George? Or was it their mother? Harry made his decision. No representatives, no advisors, no palace staff, no lawyers. He wanted to speak to his brother alone. That question could not be answered through legal language. And for the first time since the announcement, the brothers prepared to speak without anyone standing between them. When William and Harry finally met, there was no audience to impress, and no institution to blame. For one private conversation, they were not the heir and the estranged prince. They were Diana's sons. Between them sat decades of grief, resentment, loyalty, and competing ideas of what honoring their mother actually meant. Yet the person at the center of their conversation was not either brother. It was George, and what they were willing to place on his shoulders. Harry spoke first. No aides, spouses, lawyers, or palace representatives stood between them, and that absence mattered, because neither man could hide behind formal language. William listened as his brother admitted what had hurt most. It was not simply George receiving the archive. It was discovering the final decision through formal confirmation, as though his connection to Diana had become something defined by permission and access. William did not dismiss that pain. He admitted Harry should have heard the decision directly from him before any document made it feel cold or impersonal. But the prince would not reverse George's inheritance. He explained that dividing the collection would eventually force their children to inherit more than Diana's possessions. They would inherit the brothers' disagreements too, with different branches protecting different letters, photographs, and recordings, while arguing over which version of their grandmother mattered most. Harry challenged him quietly. He asked whether George understood what was being placed in his future hands. William answered that the boy had not been burdened with the details. He had only been taught that protecting family history was a duty, not a prize. That distinction landed differently now. George had been chosen because he was young enough to inherit responsibility without being asked to take ownership of every wound between Diana's sons. Harry fell silent. The anger he had carried into the conversation did not disappear, but it changed shape. If William truly wanted their mother's private history to outlive their feud, then one condition mattered more than any legal arrangement. Harry asked that George grow up understanding Diana belonged emotionally to both sons and to all her grandchildren, not simply to the branch closest to the crown. William agreed without hesitation. Harry looked at him for a moment and said, "Make sure he knows she was our mother before she became anyone's history." That was the turning point. Harry would not contest George's position. He would not drag Diana's archive into another family battle simply to prove that he still belonged inside her story. And that decision carried one painful consequence. Meghan still believed there was something left to fight. With that agreement, the private family conflict finally began to cool. But outside those walls, the revelation had already exploded into public view. By the time the family's private tensions began to settle, the outside world had turned George's inheritance into something far larger than a dispute over personal papers. Diana's name still carried an emotional force capable of collapsing decades into a single headline. Commentators debated legacy, succession, privacy, and family loyalty. Yet one public moment captured the story more powerfully than any argument. A crowd outside Kensington Palace, silently placing flowers beneath Diana's gates. Meghan watched the reaction spread and realized the story had escaped the limits of the private confrontation. Broadcasters framed George as Diana's eldest grandson in the direct line of succession, the family line expected to produce the future monarch, and that symbolism changed everything. Some praised the decision as careful preservation. Others questioned why Harry's branch had no shared custodial role when he remained Diana's son. The debate was no longer only about the archive. It had become another measure of the distance between the Sussex and Wales families. William refused to let George become part of that argument. He made clear in a private family conversation that the boy must never be made to believe his inheritance came at Harry's expense. The prince understood how easily responsibility could be mistaken for victory, and he wanted his son protected from that burden for as long as possible. George was meant to safeguard the collection one day, not become the face of an old family feud. Outside Kensington Palace, the public supplied its own meaning. Visitors gathered near the gates, long associated with the extraordinary mourning that followed Diana's death. Flowers appeared again, not in the same numbers, but with the same quiet emotional weight. Among them sat one handwritten card, for Diana's grandson, "Protect her truth with kindness." That single message shifted the mood. It was less about possession and more about trust. A morning newspaper pushed the same idea even further. Its front page placed Diana beside a younger image of George beneath 4 stark words: her story, his responsibility. The phrase traveled quickly because it captured what the legal language never could. The boy had not simply received something valuable. He had been handed a duty connected to one of the monarchy's most complicated memories. William saw the coverage briefly and switched off the television. Moments later, George entered, unaware of the storm surrounding his name. His father said nothing about the headlines. Harry had already chosen not to challenge the arrangement. William would not reverse it. Meghan could no longer treat the outcome as unfinished. The public could argue over winners and losers, but inside the family the answer had become clearer, and the final meaning of Diana's archive would be decided not by ownership, but by what everyone chose to do next. In the end, nobody received everything they wanted. Meghan could not change the arrangement. Harry could not erase the sting of seeing his mother's private archive placed solely within William's line. William could not protect Diana's legacy without accepting that his decision would reopen old wounds. And George inherited something far heavier than a collection of letters and photographs. He inherited responsibility, the duty to safeguard a woman he never met, but whose life permanently altered his family. George remained the sole future heir and custodian of the archive, meaning he would eventually carry the formal responsibility for protecting the collection, rather than simply owning it as ordinary property. The letters, recordings, photographs, reflections, and private family material would stay together, guarded from division, commercial use, or competing claims. Yet that protection came with an equally important boundary. Keeping the archive in one place did not mean removing Diana from the emotional lives of everyone else who loved her. Meghan slowly accepted what Harry had already decided. Her disappointment did not disappear, and neither did the feeling that Archie and Lilibet had been placed outside a responsibility held by their cousin. But she understood that pushing the fight further would force her husband into a battle he no longer wanted. Harry had made his choice. He would not challenge George, because defeating his nephew on paper would do nothing to heal the deeper fracture surrounding Diana's memory. Harry reached a quieter conclusion. The greatest inheritance he could give his children was not possession of a sealed letter or control of a private recording. It was memory. He could tell them how Diana laughed, how she loved, what frightened her, what mattered to her, and who she had been before the world turned her life into history. That knowledge could never be locked inside an archive. William accepted responsibility from the other side. Keeping the collection intact could not become an excuse to claim Diana exclusively for his branch. George would inherit the papers, but the future king would also inherit an obligation to protect their meaning, their privacy, and the people connected to them. Harry placed the old photograph back inside its envelope. Elsewhere, William returned the archive papers to their protective case. Neither brother possessed the whole of their mother's story. At last, both understood that neither ever could. The verdict was final. George would guard Diana's private archive. William would protect its future. Harry would preserve the memories only a son could carry. Meghan would accept the boundary. And Diana's emotional legacy would remain larger than any inheritance arrangement the monarchy could create. There was no further battle waiting behind another palace door. Prince George had become the guardian of Diana's private archive. But Diana herself still belonged in the memories of the entire family she left behind. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.